Guests and friends, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's meeting. Allow me to remind you that our next program will be a week from tonight, the 3rd of June. It will be in the Lord Baltimore Hotel. Never had a meeting there, so if any of you have questions about parking or other matters, call the council office. Our guest will, for that occasion, will be the ambassador of the Turkish Republic to the United States. And we'll try to promise no fireworks at that particular time. Also, I should note that a very short annual meeting of membership will begin at 4:45 on the 10th of June and precede the program on that date with the ambassador from the Netherlands to the United States. This evening's program, I should note, of course, is co-sponsored with the World Trade Center Institute. Our topic this evening is prospects for U.S.-South American trade. Our guest is well suited for that, holding responsibilities in the geographic area today of South America and Central America, and having held senior positions in the area of international business and economics. He began his career as a staff member with the Peace Corps. He's been a staff member with the United States Senate, a staff member in the House of Representatives, and has been on the staff of the American Enterprise Institute. He's had an impressive career in public service proper. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Treasury for International Economic Affairs. He was consultant on international economics for the White House, consultant on international economics to the Department of State. From August of '82 to June of 1985, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs. At the present time, as all of you know, he serves as Ambassador of the United States to the Organization of American States. It's an enormous pleasure to welcome to Baltimore and introduce to you Ambassador Richard T. McCormack.
Thank you very much. I'm obviously delighted to be here today. I have the privilege of going around this harbor and seeing this tremendous blend of history and tomorrow written up to what's been accomplished here. Someone like myself who's been living in the Washington area for the past 25 years. For someone like myself who's been living in the Washington area for the past 25 years, it is an amazing and impressive feat that's been accomplished in this city, and I'm sure I'm not the first and I won't be the last to say it. But I want to give tribute to those people in this room and elsewhere who made this possible. There was a tremendous blend of imagination, good zoning, investment processes that have turned this into a beautiful place. I was over here 2 weeks ago with my wife, and I visited the Constellation down here. And for someone who's my height, I went through that ship. I wondered how these people endured these long voyages in these tiny, cramped little conditions. And then my wife pointed out the menu that they had, and included on the daily menu for everyone was a cup of whiskey. so I understood how they managed to endure this. I've been the OAS ambassador for the last 2 years. It's been a fascinating assignment. The Organization of American States is, of course, the oldest regional organization of its kind in the world. It's now nearly 100 years old. It is the model on which, the organizational model on which the United Nations was based. It is a place where each country has one vote, where you can't force anybody to do anything, because the U.S. and the Haiti stand on equal footing in this organization, and where the only power you have is the power to persuade. And it's a place where one comes together and discusses things. And we have recently been obviously deeply concerned about the problem of the Latin American debt. Very deeply concerned about the problem of the drugs that have been penetrating the area, that have caused enormous problems in places like Colombia and elsewhere. We're working on the Central American issue to a degree, and it's been very interesting. And for someone like myself as the American ambassador, you are impressed with the tremendous diversity of the continent, the tremendous diversity of the region, of the members that represent you. I've had experiences where I've visited places like Sao Paulo in Brazil, which is a city the most modern in the world. Every convenience, every facility, everything is there. Fabulous, leaning buildings, tremendously dynamic business sector. And by the same token, I I have visited areas in the Andes where, with President Belaunde, actually at one point, where our party was attacked by Indians, and one was mortally wounded by an arrow. So this is the diversity of the region, from everywhere from the 21st century to really the Stone Age, and everything in between it. But I've obviously enjoyed it, and but you've asked me here today to talk about a complicated subject, which is an economic analysis of trade opportunities in Latin America. And this is a very complicated issue because you have to consider a whole range of issues when you consider future economic opportunities, future economic growth. And so I'm going to say a few words today about the political side of things. I'm going to say a few words about the debt issue, which is, of course, very important in terms of economic growth prospects for the region, and other similar aspects. The United States is now preparing to celebrate some 4 months from now the 200th anniversary of our Constitution. It is really a celebration of our nationhood as a federal republic and of democracy as a form of government. And even though we celebrated our independence more than a decade ago, and our federal republic is now the oldest such in the world, it was not until we won the War of 1812, in the battle here in Baltimore and in New Orleans and in other places, that the world powers of the time finally accepted our status as an independent nation. I recount this little bit of history because it makes an important point, that independence, freedom, and democracy are really won bit by bit, preserved by constant vigilance, and unfortunately they can also be lost little by little through lack of vigilance. Latin America at present is also fighting a battle to consolidate freedom and democracy. At the beginning of this decade, only 30% of the people in the region lived in a democratic form of government. Today, 90% of the people in the region live in a democratic form of government. At least temporarily, the battle for democracy has been lost in Cuba, and the issue now hangs by a thread in Nicaragua. There are political problems in other countries. The Soviet Union is giving increased attention to the area with the objective of seizing opportunities and creating additional governments in its own totalitarian image. And as I will make clear in my remarks, Latin America is generally having a tough time because of severe economic problems. But in the past 200 years, the countries of Latin America have learned much about freedom and how to protect and preserve it. I believe this has all been to the good, and we in the United States have had a major role in helping make this hemisphere a land of liberty. The issues that our Latin American friends are debating at the present time are the same ones that we dealt with in the growth and consolidation of our own democracy. And what are these issues? 1, whether government should be based on the concept that governments derive their powers from the just consent of the governed, and that all citizens should have an equal opportunity to participate. That is one issue which we take for granted, but is now debated in other parts of this hemisphere. Another issue is whether private individuals and groups should have the primary responsibility for controlling and allocating resources on a national scale, with maximum reliance on individual freedom and initiative and equal justice, or whether this process should be done by fiat, by government and bureaucracy. Another issue is whether the people, through their representatives, should decide the amount of taxes that government should take, or whether those governings should decide that for themselves. Whether the executive branch should control the legislature and judiciary, or whether each should be independent and a balance against the other. Whether the military should be under control of the civilians, or the other way around. How the United States handles its relations with Latin America over the next few years, both public and private, will have a profound influence on this debate and whether this hemisphere is, and continues to be, a land of liberty. There are those who do not wish democracy well. There are those who do not believe in free market economics, and they actively seek at every opportunity to disparage these values. As I said, you have asked me to talk a bit about trade, and I should remind you that this was a key issue in our own independence. Britain had sought to impose on us a mercantilist trade policy. Under the old rules, the colonies had to trade with England in their terms. The British Parliament imposed taxes on goods shipped to the colonies to pay for the cost of administration in the colonies, without giving the colonies a voice, and hence the Boston Tea Party and the revolution which followed, and our strongly held views on free trade and an open trading system which grew out of that unfortunate experience. But we are still confronted by a thriving mercantilist ideology in Latin America, which was carried there originally by the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers in the 17th and 18th century. Policies such as these, which limit economic freedom and initiative, are as much a threat to economic prosperity in Latin America as they were to American independence over 200 years ago. We are, of course, pleased that more and more Latin American countries are shifting from such policies to more open and market-oriented policies. Mexico and several other American countries have recently joined or announced their intention to join the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, more popularly known as GATT. The current round of GATT was initiated in Uruguay, the first time ever that a GATT governing body has met in Latin America. And we are strongly committed to a policy of free and fair trade, welcoming the growing commitment of others, and very hopeful that trade negotiations now in progress in the GATT will make a major contribution to strengthening the free world trading system. However, trade imbalances that could lead to protectionism have arisen under the current system. The U.S. trade deficit has become a major economic problem for the United States, and consequently a national political issue. The focus is primarily, of course, on Japan, and to a lesser extent on Western Europe, and especially West Germany. Japan and the Western European countries are major players in the world economic scene, and they, like ourselves, have a major stake in a healthy world economy. So it is exceedingly important that we have a dialogue and seek adjustments in situations that are contributing to economic disequilibria throughout the world. But U.S. exports to Latin America, even in their current depressed state, exceed those to Japan by 1/3. Our sales to our 4 largest customers in Europe combined, the UK, West Germany, Netherlands, and France, were about $34 billion last year. Our exports to Latin America were $31 billion, which gives you some idea of the enormous importance they are to our economy. If we are to talk about merchandise trade, then we need to take a look at the Western Hemisphere, because it is here, in this hemisphere, that the United States has its largest markets. Today, Canada is our largest single trading partner. Our sales to Latin America were growing by leaps and bounds in the 1970s, and surpassed that with Canada in 1980 and 81, before the debt crisis, because Latin America was then generally growing at a rate of 6% per year. If our sales to Latin America had continued to grow at the rate they did from 1976 to 1981, we would today be exporting almost twice as much to Latin America as we do today to Canada. If we could get Japan and Germany to expand their markets for U.S. goods, would that change the equation? Would Latin America then be as important as I have suggested it could be? Certainly it is essential that Western Europe and Japan expand their economies and open up their markets, not only for our exports, but for those of Latin America. This is a major object of U.S. policy. If we are to have a healthy and growing world economy, we must correct the distortion in the world trading system created by the huge surpluses held especially by Japan and West Germany. But as the business journals point out, the marginal propensity to increase exports by Japan and Germany, to increase imports by Japan and Germany, is relatively low. On the other hand, it is very clear that the marginal propensity to import in developing areas such as Latin America is enormous. It is also clear that Latin America has great potential for growth and can generate the income needed to pay for essential imports. So more open markets in Western Europe and Japan would change the equation somewhat, but it would not alter the point that I am making, that the countries in the hemisphere have been and continue to be our most important market. If we want to improve our export performance significantly, if we want to provide more jobs to poor Americans, then a major challenge is to get Latin America back on a growth path. The Latin American debt crisis. Latin America and the Caribbean are still trying to recover from the worst economic crisis in decades. While there has been important progress, there has also been some recent tension and slippage in the past few months. We must continue to help the fragile democracy of the hemisphere overcome this crisis and get back to the path to prosperity and long-term sustained growth. It will not only help us economically and financially, but it will also help ensure that democratic governments in Latin America will become more permanent fixtures in the democratic constellation of this hemisphere. The facts and figures on this crisis, which has been going on for 5 years, are well known. 1. Gross national product growth in 1986 was about 3%. This is a major in Latin America. This is a major improvement over 1983, when Latin America's per capita income fell by 3%. 2. Despite urgent needs for capital for economic development, Latin America is a capital exporting area with the heaviest debt burden in the world. Investment flows into the area dropped from some 49 billion annually in the beginning of the 1980s to about 6 billion annually now. Commodity prices for Latin American products are generally off by 30%, though some have recently firmed. On the other hand, the fall in interest rates has helped reduce debt service costs. Because of the debt problem and the minimal growth in Latin America, our trade with our southern neighbors swung from a $6.7 billion surplus in 1981 to a $17.7 billion deficit in 1984 and a $13.4 billion deficit in 1986. Our trade deficit has made a major contribution to stabilizing Latin America's economic and financial situation over the past 5 years. But that does not obscure the fact that the Latin American economic crisis has had a substantial impact on us domestically, because it has not been able to buy from us the product that it needs and wants. U.S. exports to Latin America. Let me sketch briefly for you what the trade picture was before the debt crisis hit in 1982, and to indicate why it is so important to the U.S. economy, and why we must make a stronger effort to get growth going again in Latin America and the Caribbean. From 1977 to 1981, our exports to Latin America increased from $18 billion annually to $42 billion annually. Our exports more than doubled in terms of current dollars. Primarily because of the debt crisis, our exports dropped over 25% to $30 billion, what they were in 1979. We moved from a surplus position to a decidedly deficit position, a swing of over some $20 billion. What would the situation be if our trade with the area had continued to increase in the 1980s at even half the rate of growth of the 1970s? Given the possibilities for growth in the area and the demand that generates, I think that this is a realistic and sustainable objective. We would now have export sales of about $70 billion, about $40 billion more than we are actually selling. Our imports from Latin America would undoubtedly have risen correspondingly, that is, more than they have, but we would not have the huge trade deficit, and all of us would have benefited. But what are the obstacles to economic growth that would make this kind of export performance possible? There are many of them, and we're working to try and help them fix them. First, there has to be investment if there is to be optimum growth. It is imperative that governments pursue tax and economic policies that encourage savings in individual countries, and equally important, to keep those savings at home. Capital flight in Latin America, estimates of which range from $100 to $180 billion in the last 6 years, robbed these nations of their vital investment capital. If this capital could be recovered, it would largely eliminate the foreign debt problem in Argentina, Mexico, and Venezuela. We might talk about replacing this flight capital with official lending, but instead of priming a pump, foreign assistance under these circumstances without major policy reforms in these countries would simply be pouring water into a sieve. Why is there capital flight? First, because many of these countries have had negative interest rates, because they try to control the cost of money. Naturally, those who have money are going to put it where it will earn a high return, and not disappear because of inflation and other factors. That usually means that it ends up in U.S. or Swiss banks. People know when the exchange rates are out of line with economic and financial conditions, and they take steps to get their money out of the economy before the exchange rate collapses and they lose half or two-thirds of their equity. So it's very important that governments maintain realistic exchange rates that are sustainable and that people will perceive to be sustainable. As I say, inflation is another problem. Who is going to keep their life savings, their retirement savings in an economy and in a country where they're being inflated out of existence? People take them out, put them into inflation-proof assets and remove them. These are problems that have to be dealt with. Another reaction of governments when they're faced with these kinds of problems is to try to wall in capital. The mere fact that government attempts to do this encourages more capital to flee, and it's virtually impossible to wall capital into a country. What you simply wind up with is a de facto export tax of about 5 or 10% as people seek various sub-legal devices to get their money out of the country. The point that is required can be summed up in one word, and that is confidence. Domestic investors have to believe that their government will treat them fairly, and they will follow up with long-term consistent policies that serve the general welfare of all the citizens and not just the favored few. Foreign investors are guided by confidence displayed by national investors. When people see the local people investing in local economies, then foreign capital comes in and invests. When they see local people pouring their money out of the country, it isn't exactly a sign that other people should invest in these particular countries. So it's very important that government pursue policies that will inspire local confidence, because with local confidence will come international confidence. And you can't fake it. Today, information is a widely available commodity. If governments say one thing and just does something else, you see that very quickly on their monetary policy, you see it very quickly in their fiscal policy. You know what is going to happen 8 or 9 months down the pike, and so people take preventative action. So it has to be real. Other factors, it is very important that they bring in technology from abroad. There are certain comparative factors in places like in a number of Latin American countries where there's inexpensive labor. If they can combine inexpensive labor with foreign technology and foreign capital, you have a going proposition. Without that, you don't. So those people who say we want to keep out the foreign competitors and keep our local people here so that they can continue to function are basically dooming themselves to industries which are uncompetitive on a global basis. They can't sell them outside their products outside their country because they're obsolete. So they basically have doomed themselves to obsolete technology by short-sighted policies attempting to keep foreign investors out. So there are many problems that have to do with getting growth going in Latin America again. I haven't mentioned the fear factor. When you have a country which is threatened by terrorists and saboteurs and the kidnappers and things of this nature, people take their savings out and they take their children out. So the investment stops. Take a country like El Salvador. El Salvador in the 1960s had one of the fastest growing economies of any place in the world. In fact, it was the fastest growing one particular year. Then came the kidnappers, the terrorists, the saboteurs, kidnapping the children of people who were investing, kidnapping the children of managers of foreign companies and holding them for ransom, interrupting coffee harvests, killing foremen of coffee plantations. And what happened? Investment stopped. And an economy which was going very well went downstream very rapidly, a course which has not been interrupted even today. So the point that I think one would have to make is to improve the economic climate in Latin American countries. You can't just deal with one factor and ignore the others. You have to systematically deal with each factor that is preventing economic growth. You have to have sound macroeconomic policies. You have to pursue non-inflationary policies. You have to have tax policies that are internationally competitive. You have to deal with your local terrorists and get the assistance that are required to deal with these kind of problems. Because unless you stop the kidnapping, you're not going to get the investment that is required. So these are the kinds of problems that all bound together are preventing growth in Latin America and things that we have to work with our Latin American friends to deal with. I will say that it's been my observation as I've been traveling around Latin America that the problems that many of these face are simply too big for an individual country to deal with. Take the problem of Peru. In Peru, you have got 5,000 or 6,000 shining path guerrillas, and these people have paralyzed that country. How do you deal with those problems? People that are prepared to pay, to offer their lives to disrupt the society. I had a long conversation with one man who had been named by his president to try to make peace between the individual groups, between the Shining Path, which represents a group of Indians in the hinterland, and the other people. He sent a letter to the head of the Shining Path movement and said he would like to make peace, bring peace to Peru. And this man was a wonderful human being. He was the leading neurosurgeon in the country. He was a man about 65 years old, a very warm and decent human being who had a wonderful reputation throughout the country. So he sent this. The president named him to make peace between the Shining Path guerrillas and the people of Lima. And he received a letter back. And he says, if you genuinely want to bring peace to this country, the greatest service that you personally can do is to kill yourself. He said, we will not kill you now because we know that you're a man of basically goodwill. But we repeat, the greatest, if you wish to bring peace to Peru, the greatest service that you personally can perform is to kill yourself. Then this man went to the prisons where there were hundreds and hundreds of shining cat guerrillas that had been captured. And he systematically talked with 75 or 80 of these people to see if he couldn't reach some of them. And he tried for 3 or 4 weeks to do this. He said he tried every psychological technique that a lifetime of dealing with medicine and human beings would have made possible. And he said he failed to reach a single person. And he said, after I failed, I simply gave up and returned to my medical practice. These are the kind of bitternesses and tensions that exist in these societies where that cannot be solved on a short-term basis, that can be solved on a longer-term basis. There, as you well know, there is tremendous poverty in the Andean mountains of Peru. People live on almost subsistence levels. There's a lot of bitterness. Some people have convinced these people that Marxism is the solution to their problem, not to the sort of Marxism that are practiced in the Soviet Union, but the kind that was practiced by Mao Zedong. And thus the war has continued, and many people have died. And when I was in Lima last, 10 bombs went off in the city, including one that broke the windows in the place I was staying. So these are the kind of problems that are faced by a number of these countries, and that perhaps working together in organizations like the Organization of American States, we can begin to make some progress with. You move on to places like Colombia. I was down in Colombia a year ago with the Secretary of State to have a major meeting of the OAS. It took thousands of troops to keep us alive. We arrived just days after the Supreme Court of that country had been attacked by the drug dealers and their local hired communist killers, and where most of the Supreme Court had been butchered. During the time that I was there, before I arrived, the Secret Service begged the Secretary of State not to go. But he said, if I'm afraid to show my face down here, how can we inspire other people to take risks? So he disregarded the security advisors. He went down to Colombia with me, and we hammered out a program to begin to make some progress on the war against drugs. And the OAS has recently done some very important work in that area, as you may have seen. So I say the long and the short of this discussion is that there are problems in Latin America. The situation is better now than it was 3 or 4 years ago when we were in the midst of the debt crisis. There are tremendous opportunities for growth of exports in Latin America. We can sell more of our goods abroad, but we have to help them, first by persuading them to adopt economic policies that will result in growth, and secondly, doing more, I think, to help them with their local terrorist problems. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and open it up to questions.
Well, we do thank you for that cogent and informative and also interesting introductory statement. The floor will be open for questions until 10 minutes after 7. Yes, sir.
What do you think the impact of the city for setting aside $3 billion in terms of the debt profit will be on the economic situation?
The question is, what impact do I think the decision of Citicorp to set aside several $1 billion as potential loss from their foreign loans will have on the overall situation? I personally, and I'm speaking just as an individual, I personally greeted that. Why did I greet that? Because interest rates are beginning to rise a bit. Political pressures are beginning to exert themselves in places like Brazil. If those countries negotiating with the banks feel they have the banks in a very bad position and they have no choice but to make any kind of a deal, that puts them in a bad negotiating position, very bad negotiating position. Furthermore, who knows what is going to happen in that part of the world. So I think that the decision to set aside some loan loss reserves was a prudent decision. I hope that other banks will do the same. I also know that the business cycle still exists. We've had a recovery now, which has been almost the longest since the Second World War. Inevitably, there is a downturn of the business cycle, followed, of course, by another upturn. But when that downturn takes place, 2-3 years from now, there will be pressure on some of the bank's domestic clients again. And if they had not made reserves now to deal with the problems that come from the foreign loan, and had to absorb all of those during a period of domestic, temporary domestic difficulty, I think it would have put stress on the financial system that was not wise to run that kind of a risk. So I applaud the decision of Citibank to set aside reserves. It's a good insurance policy. If they don't need them, so much the better. But if they do, it's good that they have them there. And I think it's very good that they didn't put all this off until the day when there was a temporary downturn in the world economy, because I think that would have been dangerous. So that's the answer to your question, my point of view.
Yes, sir.
This is not an economic question, except insofar as you say all other aspects of the picture in a relationship to it. But I am ignorant, and perhaps you can inform me, and maybe just give some context. You said that there's such a high percentage of democracy now in South America, and yet there's also a great deal of instability, as if this democracy may not be a good thing or is a good thing. What about what we read in our history book, that there was a wave of revolution for freedom about a century ago, and they lost their democracies or freedom? Is there any relationship in the story of where we are now?
Yes. The question is, there were democracies in the past, and they collapsed, and now we have democracies again. What does this all mean? I can go back even farther than that. One of the most interesting parts of Plato's writing is his description about the cyclic nature of government. How governments tend to start out as tyrannies, how over time these tyrannies broaden into oligarchies, how the oligarchies tend to broaden into democracies, how democracies tend to broaden into anarchies, and then how out of anarchies comes tyranny again. And he refers to it as a perpetual cycle. Now, he lived at a time in ancient Greece when you had many, many different city-states, all at different stages of political development. So he had an empirical laboratory of this process, and he simply described it in his writing. He also described, in rather disturbing terms, the symptoms of a democracy in its final phase. So the point is, will we learn from history? And will we avoid carrying democracy to its ultimate excess, which leads to its ultimate destruction? Can our Latin American friends be encouraged to follow policies that are likely to lead to a sustainable situation, or not? Now, one of the symptoms that Plato describes in his writings as a democracy in its last phase is excessive consumption and insufficient investment. In other words, too many people on welfare of one form or another, and insufficient people producing goods for those, and that the economy gets out of kilter. That was one of the conditions he described, and many others that he described. In the case of Latin America, there has to be sustained economic growth. And we recently have gone through a very difficult situation in Brazil. The Brazilians overstimulated their economy in advance of elections, and everything looked good on the day of election. People all voted for the party in power, and then 2 weeks later the roof fell in. Now, that sort of thing discredits democracy. It causes people to lose faith in democracies. It causes people to lose faith in democratic leaders. It is a problem that, frankly, would happen when I was in the Nixon White House. And we had a recession in 1970, and we had a year or so later, we had wage and price controls, and the monetary supply was stepped up, and everything looked wonderful in 1972 for the election. And then after that, we had a serious recession. The wage and price controls blew apart, and serious inflation took off, and we had to control that inflation by a serious recession that threw millions of Americans out of work. So the hope is that just as we learned our lesson, when President Ford was faced by the decision a year later, or 2 years later, whether to play the same game again, he simply told his economic advisors to take a walk. He said, "I'm not going to get myself reelected at the price of destabilizing the American economy again." And he refused to listen to those people. And he lost the election. But he doesn't regret that decision. My hope is that the people of Brazil and the people of other parts of Latin America will learn from the example of the Brazilian experience, and they will not repeat this mistake. That's my hope. That's the only hope for democracy, that we learn from past mistakes and to prevent it from happening again.
separate groups, looking Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore. Compare that engine with the South American engine of Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, Mexico. And Chile is one of the great democracies. You have to check that.
Repeat the question, please.
One engine works and the other engine doesn't work.
The question is, he points out the enormous prosperity that has taken place in East Asia over the course of the last 15 or 20 years. How that you've taken a situation from Hong Kong, which was composed of people that were uneducated, impoverished, arriving on that island with nothing except a willingness to work. And in the course of 15 or 20 years, they turned it into all of the security conditions, a favorable tax climate. You don't build such an enormous government that to support it, you have to increase taxes to the point that you don't have enough investment income. If you have your adequate technology so that you're dealing on the forefront of technology and you're able to sell to world markets, if you do all of these things, you can get economic growth going in your countries again. If you do not, you're going to have problems. And the fact of the matter is there is no secret. I mean, we know from history what enables an economy to grow. And we know from history what causes economies to stagnate. And the numbers tell the story. So my hope is, I happen to believe in places like Brazil. They're going through a difficult period right now. But if you take a look at the long-term growth of Brazil since the Second World War, it has been phenomenal.
Well, I left out Brazil and I left out Japan because those are the anchors which are the exceptions.
But my hope
But
is,
it's the other, everything else below those two levels is a disaster in America compared to Asia.
but you know, 3% growth isn't bad. And this year we've had 3% growth in Latin America. I would be perfectly happy if 3% or 4% growth could be sustained over an indefinite period. I say that. I would like it better if it could be 10%. The people who reach for 10% growth rates run the risk of blowing up their economies periodically. I would prefer a stable growth. I think that one can learn from success stories.
There's a lot written about this debt for equity in the debt crisis thing. What equity are they talking about? I assume they're talking about banks, U.S. banks taking ownership in Latin American businesses or governments, and how is that reviewed in Latin America?
The question is, there's been a lot of talk about debt equity swaps as a means of liquidating part of the debt. And how can this be done as a practical matter? Well, Chile has just liquidated 15% of its international debt. The way it can be done is there are many governments have invested in inefficient state-owned factories. These same factories, if they could be run on a private basis, would in many cases be far more efficient. Some of them, of course, are white elephants, and no one would want to buy them whether they were state or private. But many of them have the potential for being operated on a much more efficient basis than is now the case. And I'm going to give you an example. I have visited 2 oil refineries. One that was both built the same time and in the same period, and one of them was in state hands, and the other one remained in private hands. The other one factory had 600 people, and the other had 5,000 people, both producing the same amount of output. Same basic factory. So the hope is that governments can be persuaded to sell off or to trade off their debt for shared equity and shared participation in some of these state-owned factories, and that they can be run more efficiently and therefore contribute to the national economy rather than absorbing through endless subsidies investment capital that would otherwise be spent more fruitfully. That's the hope. And there's been a lot of movement in this direction. There's been more talk than movement. But there has been some important movement in places like Chile. One hopes that others would begin to look at this example. And I know that's what we in the Department of State are particularly looking to as one of the major hopes for the future.
Health is one deal with what is perceived 2 major problems, which are really more social and economic. One is the tremendous disparity, the distribution of wealth in Latin America, and the other is the tremendous overpopulation.
question is, how can one deal with two complicated problems in Latin America? One is overpopulation. The other is the perceptions that there's disparities in income levels. I'm a Republican. I'm going to say something that there is such thing as a phase in capital, in the development of societies called concentration of capital, so that you have people who have surpluses who can invest those surpluses. I don't myself have trouble with that as a phase in a historic development. When you have a situation, the old style oligarchies that one thinks about from reading Latin American histories are to a large extent a thing of the past. Yes, there are still important old families, just as there are important old families in the United States. But there are also lots and lots of important new families, and there's lots of important opportunity in Latin America. I would not be in favor of taxation that would result in everybody having middle class income. Why would I not be in favor? Because I think it would take away a lot of the incentive, and it would prevent what I think is important, which is a degree of concentration of capital, so that you can have investment and economic growth. So that's my Republican answer to one question. My answer to your other question is how can one deal with the population problem? This is obviously a very complicated problem in a society that is profoundly Catholic. They reject the ideas of birth control, at least the classical forms of birth control that are customary in this country. How do you deal with that? It's a moral question. For the gringo to come down and tell them they ought to ignore their religious beliefs would be ineffective. So that is the hope has been that in places like Japan and elsewhere, as economic prosperity has risen, you have seen family size get smaller and smaller. In the old days of farms, large numbers of children not only represented useful field hands, but they also represented an important source of social security. In the new, more modern economies, this is not the same, and you have a whole different set of dynamics working. So my hope would be that in their own enlightened self-interest, that the trends that we have seen, which is a downturn in these population trends, will continue, and to a much greater degree. That's my hope. Next non-religious question.
In the trade area, what percentage of the exports U.S. exports to the public sector, and what part of it is to the private sector? In the public sector, like military merchandise, equipment supplies, and services to the government, and what part is to the private sector? And and in the area of private sector, who are the competitors to the United States? Taiwan, Japan, and if Americans are not themselves buying things from, that they should, they're buying from others. Is there any area that we discourage those American supplies and goods?
The question is, what is the profile of our exports to Latin America? Public versus private? Are we selling a lot of weapons to Latin America? Is that a major component? No, it really is not. Most of our exports to Latin America are private exports of food and machinery and high-tech things that we export in significant quantities. The question about whether we should, who are our competitors? We today function in a global market. Those people who produce the best goods for the best price and the best service and the most aggressive sales are going to make sales. Where our firms are poised to do that, they will succeed. Where they do not, they will be outcompeted by their competitors in Asia. I mean, frankly, we had a difficulty with the dollar and the yen some time ago, and I believe that the high value of the dollar was sustained imprudently long, and I think that was a mistake. Period. Not everybody agrees with me, but that's certainly my view. And we've allowed an enormous trade problem to build up in East Asia. But my belief is that now that the dollar and the yen are at a more rational level, that this problem, particularly with Japan, will correct itself over time. That's my belief, and will make our exports more competitive than they are today, than they were 3 or 4 years ago.
Do you have a question, Mr. Angelo?
Well, the question that I wanted to ask has almost been asked. When we were in South America, we had the impression that in most of the countries that 90% of the wealth was in the owned by 5% of the people. And you said that that is beginning to disappear, but I don't know how they make it disappear. That's a hard thing to separate from the people who have it.
They're going through the same process that we went through about the turn of the century here, where you had wealth concentrated in the hands of a handful of very wealthy people. And then gradually over the course of our political history in the 20th century, things balance themselves out. And this process, I think, will take place in other parts of the world. But step by step and in accordance with their own internal political and economic dynamics.
How important is education in that situation?
Education it provides opportunity. If you do not have an education, you have no opportunity. Without opportunity, you can't rise up in the ladder. So education is absolutely critically important, and it's been the means by which all of us have risen in our own societies.
One account is there.
It varies by country, but by and large, it's bad. Take, for example, Brazil. What they do in high school education is what we were doing about the turn of the century. Most of our people are graduating in 8th grade. That's what they're doing. There's a tremendous amount of talent that's being wasted in Brazil. In a modern era where education provides an economic premium in societies that are highly educated. So it is in their own interest to concentrate more of their money on education, particularly business. And my belief is that they will continue to make some progress in this area. They're aware of their problem, and they're trying to shift resources into that area. Other places like Haiti, and where you have a per capita income of $300 a head, just simply doesn't have the resources that it needs to educate its people in a short period of time. That's where the international community can be helpful.
A non-economic question. What is the OAS doing as far as Nicaragua, and what can they do?
The question, what is the OAS doing with regard to Nicaragua, and what can they do? In 1979, the Sandinistas sent a cable to the OAS, which they all signed, and said there was a deplorable human rights problem in our country. If you will help us deal with the Somoza and the terrible human rights problems we are having here, we will guarantee that we will be pluralistic, non-aligned, democratic, with civil rights, and so on and so on. Based on that telex and that pledge signed by the current head of government of Nicaragua, the OAS tilted in the direction of the Sandinistas, and Somoza became a figment of the past. Unfortunately, the Sandinistas did not adhere to the promises they made to the OAS. And this has been a source of obvious deep concern throughout the world, throughout the Western Hemisphere, ever since that has happened. What can the OAS do about it? We have commissioned the Condadora group to examine the possibilities for making peace. This group has failed because of the unwillingness of the Sandinistas to adhere to the pledges they made to the OAS, which involves returning to a meaningful democracy. That's been the rock on which it's failed thus far. The president felt that it was only military pressures that would encourage the Sandinistas to moderate their essentially Leninist views, and that's what he's been trying to do with a weapon that perhaps was not strong enough to do the job. But that was the intention. That was one of the intentions. Another reason why he wanted to do this is we had during 1980 training camps being set up in Nicaragua, train young Salvadorian guerrillas in guerrilla warfare and terrorism, trained by Cubans with weapons brought in from the East Bloc. And it was felt that a combination of internal tyranny and the export of revolution simply necessitated some armed force to absorb the energies and force of that very militant group. And that was, out of that came the Contra operation. What can the OAS do at this point? The OAS first went through a period of embarrassment, because when we were embarrassed by the fact that we believed we accepted the pledges of the Sandinistas, and then we were found to be fooled. And so there was a lot of quiet behind the scenes embarrassment and shuffling of feet. The second thing that happened was within the hemisphere there was not a great deal of information available about what was really happening in Nicaragua. So we were dealing in an area where there was a lot of ignorance. Even in the United States, where you have such relatively high areas of education, there's not one American in 1,000 that can take a map of Central America and accurately write in the countries on that map. Not one in 1,000, maybe one in 10,000. And even lacking that basic information, when you start getting down into some of the internal ramifications of the situation there, people simply are uninformed. And the problem we had of informing our people was complicated 100-fold in regions where the education levels were far, far lower than ours. So it has taken a long time. For a long time, there were many people in Latin America who felt that the Sandinistas were simply people that were being the victim of the latest gringo interventionist policies. That was a feeling that you found. A feeling that was a legacy of a policy of dollar diplomacy that we followed in the early part of the 20th century, where you had dozens of interventions because people weren't paying their bills. They had manhandled one of our diplomats in a coastal city, or this or that or the other. So people said, well, here's just the gringos again. That was the instinctive reaction. That's no longer the case. We had a meeting at the OAS in Guatemala at the foreign minister level this year, where the issue was debated. And one of the more cynical of our group suggested that maybe we should just dispense with the idea of democracy and forget about it. This was resoundingly rejected by the foreign ministers. They told the group that came up with that proposal to leave the room and to come back with a resolution that would respect the principles of the OAS of democracy. And that happened. And there was a human rights report issued by the Organization of American States, which roundly denounced the behavior of the Sandinistas to their own people, that it caused 10% of the entire population to flee the country. So there was a general sense of disquiet, unhappiness, a realization that something terrible had happened in one of our sister republics, that we were in fact partly responsible for that, because we had accepted in good faith the assurances of others that what was a dictatorship before would no longer be one, that would be a better situation. These are the kinds of things that happened in the cloakrooms and behind the scenes of the OAS. And the question was then what to do. Many people assumed that there would just be increased military pressures on the Sandinistas, and that would help resolve the problem. And then came this disaster for the administration with the North and all the rest of this business. And what was perceived to be a problem that would probably be solved now is up in question again. So what can the OAS do? The OAS in the past has monitored and verified peacekeeping arrangements. Possibly the OAS could do this again. The OAS in the past has stopped wars and things of that nature. But what we all agree to is that there must be democracy in Nicaragua. That has to be our approach, and we've got to sort of nudge them in that direction. That's a very long answer to a short question, but that's the way it is.
There's a question on the far right.
Based on what I've read, much of it has been read myself anyway, the economy of Latin America was on the threshold of becoming rather successful 20 to 25 years ago. Would you comment on whether you believe that was the case, and what happened to bring it to the position it's in now? And the second question, what happened to Daniel Ludwig's project?
He refers to the writings of one of my predecessors, Saul Linowitz, who was formerly the ambassador of the Organization of American States, and who was a personal friend of mine, who's been, I say, very helpful to me in my current incarnation. He made an observation that the economy moved up 25 years ago and then found itself in difficulties. That has happened. But the fact of the matter is you cannot generalize. 25 years ago, things were going well in El Salvador, things were going well in places like Brazil, things were going well in lots of other places. They were not going so well in a number of other places. One of the things that caused the economies of Latin America to have serious problems was the oil shock. When you suddenly forced economies that were very dependent upon oil imports to pay 12, triple, quadruple, quintuple the price for the product, it's going to throw a fragile economy into equilibrium. As you know, it was the increase in the oil price that was the original father of the debt problem. Because to sustain the situation, they simply borrowed money from the New York banks to enable them to go through a period of adjustment. Unfortunately, they borrowed money and they spent it badly. instead of spending it on projects that would result in financing new exports, a lot of it was spent on prestige projects, on subsidies that were eaten and worn by people. I was in Mexico right after the debt crisis hit there, and I discovered they had subsidies on more than 1,000 items that were bought and consumed by people. And that's not money that's going into investment, it's just producing this product for export. So that is one of the major reasons why what Saul described occurred in Latin America. The second question was what happened to Mr. Ludwig's project to open up the Amazon. This was a man who's been a real visionary who spent billions of dollars opening up the Amazon, and he could never get it to be profitable. He planted trees, hoped to turn the trees into paper, new forms of trees. Some of the land that he bought that wasn't as fertile as he thought it was. Took longer to get the trees to grow than he had hoped. There were marketing problems. He was harassed by some of the local bureaucrats. And all this together took a project that was carefully planned and just made it marginally unprofitable. And he eventually sold it off at an enormous loss.
One other question about it. Is it your opinion that the government of Brazil could have helped him a lot more than it did rather than harassing the project? I mean, I know it's a difficult question to answer, but wasn't there some hope for that project for the Brazilian government?
I think he felt that they could have done more to help him. But you know, there's a very fine line that you have to walk between the government financing another white elephant, another inefficient enterprise, and harassing someone. And I think there was some of both that was involved in the dispute between Ludwig and the government. But I'm not really an expert on this subject. I've read about the vision passing as a sort of a phenomenon, but you probably know much more about this than I do.
Yes, sir.
What year about was Ludwig's project?
This was 10 or 15 years ago. It still exists. It was bought off and sold to local people, and there are still elements of that functioning.
Well, what prompted my question is what just came up. Because my question is, how come the scientists, the IMF, when Brazil says, hey, what is it, 600 miles out to Brasilia? We're going to build this terrific new capital. We're going to take all the damn trees down, and you can get all acreage of, I don't know how much acres they're given for free, like the west of the United States. And the scientists of the IMF said, no, the ground will not grow anything. Now, how does that slip by?
The IMF was not monitoring Brazil at the time they made their decision to move their capital from Brazil, from Rio to Brazil. But I will have to tell you,
the money had to come out of IMF.
Pardon me?
Money came out of IMF to do the major financing.
I'm not sure that did happen. I know that the IMF has been involved more recently with Brazil, but whether they were involved 25 years ago, that was before my time, and I'm not familiar with that. I can tell you this, that that I visited the area around Brasilia with the Secretary of Agriculture, Jack Block. We toured farms, and you'll be happy to know that the Brazilians discovered various ways of taking those soils, which were heavily aluminum, and turning them into enormously productive soybean farms with the application of chemicals which suppress the alumina, bound up the alumina, and now we visit farm after farm after farm.
What percentage are you estimating?
I couldn't even estimate. All I can tell you is they've solved the problem, and now those farms are doing tremendously well.
I'm curious about the economic structure of the Central American countries and the danger of not assisting their economy as a way of preventing Nicaragua's spread of revolution. It seems to me that failing to do that, you're making right ground for an expansion. Could you comment, please?
The lady says that she feels very strongly that we need to put more money in Central America to help those economies grow, to make them more resistant to the blandishments of communist and communist terrorists. I think we need to do. We are, as a matter of fact, providing a very substantial amounts of aid to the Central American countries. The problem we have is this. As I spoke to a group of Guatemalans not long ago, they said that we simply live in fear. You people are down here, you've got the Contras going, the Sandinistas are all busy with the Contras at this point. What happens if these guys fail and the Sandinistas no longer have to deal with 17,000 armed men inside their country? Why aren't they simply going to turn their tender attentions back to us again, which is what they were doing before you had the Contras in the first place? And they pointed out that the Sandinistas had trained 600 young Costa Ricans in guerrilla warfare and terrorism. Costa Rica has got as much a model democracy as exists anywhere in the world, and that the Costa Rican government is good enough to satisfy the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Are we? Those are the kinds of comments you heard. The problem is that when you have that kind of fear, people simply do not invest their whole savings in the region. And the closer you get to combat, the closer you get to actual combat in places like El Salvador, the greater the degree of fear exists. So unless you somehow can deal with the problem of the terrorists, it's very hard to create the climate where foreign aid is not just water poured into a sieve. And it goes in, buys something, and then goes out to a bank outside the country. That's the problem we have. It's reality, and that's what we have to deal with in that complicated part of the world.
Yes, sir.
Are the majority of the OAS members in favor of or opposed to the United States providing military aid to the Contras?
The question is whether the OAS is in favor or opposed to the U.S. providing military aid to the Contras. The OAS has never taken a position on this issue. They have discussed, individual members of the OAS have discussed the issue. And you get, in both in public and in private. And sometimes there's an enormous difference between what people say publicly and what they say privately. The closer you get to the actual problem in Nicaragua, the more support you find for the Contras. The farther away you get, when you get down to the tip of South America, they don't feel, for some reason, quite as concerned about the Sandinistas as the people in El Salvador do.
The OAS is sometimes not considered a very effective organization. Can you give 3 examples of success stories that the OAS has relatively recently had?
The question, the lady says that the OAS does not have a reputation for being an effective organization. Can I give examples of 3 success stories that we have had in recent years? Yes. And I can give you 3 more than I can give to the United Nations. There was a war between Honduras and El Salvador, and the OAS stopped that war, organized threatened sanctions against participants unless they cooperated with it, provided a peacekeeping force that got between them and stopped that war. And today, Salvador and Honduras have got rather cordial relations. But it was a very bloody, bitter, unpleasant little conflict. So that is one success story. What we have done in the drug problem, you have not read about it in the American newspapers, because the American newspapers, for reasons unknown to me, don't cover things that take place in the OAS. But the Organization of the American States had a very important meeting in Rio de Janeiro. And that meeting, it was held at the ministerial level. And there were 28 speeches that were made. And before that meeting, the Latin Americans used to say to us privately, you have a problem. You have a demand problem in the U.S. We're simply getting rich. Please don't bother us with your problem. I mean, that in a naked way was the attitude of many Latin Americans. And that made cooperation very difficult to achieve. What happened in Rio was a fundamental change in that. There were 28 speeches made. And to summarize those speeches, they were this: we are all producers. We are all consumers. We are all victims. The hour is late. The problem is bigger than any one of us, and we're going to have to work together to get hold of this thing. Based on those decisions, we set up a drug commission at the OAS, modeled after our Human Rights Commission, which is going to be a finger pointer, suggesting that countries should do this, should do that, should do the other. We're in the process now of creating model legislation so that we can say, this country, you haven't dealt with this legal problem. This is a loophole that is enabling drug people to launder money in your country. This is a loophole that is enabling these people to do this and that and the other. We have asked Senator Hawkins, who is a a lady who has a well-known interest in the drug problem to be the American representative on the Drug Commission. And so we're deadly serious. What we did in Bolivia with that cooperation between the United States Air Force and the Bolivians in making a little dent on that problem down there happened as a consequence of the decisions we made in Rio. So that's another success. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Latin Americans and Caribbeans who have been educated in the United States thanks to the scholarship program of the OAS. So I've given you 3 completely different kinds of samples to what this organization is all about, and I'm proud of it.
Not only should one stop when they're ahead, but I must apologize to Mr. Drake, Mr. Menzies, and numerous other people who still have questions. But we do want to end promptly, and our guest has been good enough to condense a 2-hour presentation into an hour and 10 minutes, and we appreciate that very much. Marvelous of you, John.